This is an interruption from our regularly scheduled podcast. I wanted to make you aware of a special event coming up on January the 27th. The Parents' Rights Coalition of Canada, PRCOC, myself and some others are organizing an event for parents groups across the country. Some tools for the new year, 2024, to push back against woke ideology and gender ideology, specifically in schools. We're going to be going over a report prepared by GenSpect and SEGM, that's the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, and a really great team of people in Canada who developed an actual evidence-based toolkit for helping children with gender dysphoria in public education. And we're going to compare and contrast that with the toolkit released in November from Western University, which is an attempt to infiltrate and make gender ideology and activism a part of every classroom every day of the year. As well, we're going to have some great insights from speakers and guests who are going to join us from across the country to share some of the victories that they've had and some of the strategies that they've found useful, and to create a public forum for us to come together. So make sure you keep watch for that. I'll be producing some links and some playbills this week and connecting and confirming speakers. January the 27th, we did that on a Saturday so we could get people coast to coast involved. We'll make sure that we straddle the time zones and we can have people from BC all the way to PEI and Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. Have a great day. Enjoy the episode, and thanks for watching. Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to the weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. We're kind of getting back to normal. It is January the 6th, 2024. If you're like me, you've messed up writing dates a couple of times this last week, and still getting used to a new year. It's an exciting one to come. Last week, we put up our year in review piece. Melanie and I had a long discussion about all the things that happened last year in the gender wars in Canada. And we're kind of kicking off with some familiar stories this week. We've got Melody Wiseheart, Braveheart, and some controversy there. April Hutchinson had some legal news going coast to coast out in BC. A 24-hour protests over the holiday season. Were joined last week by leader of the Conservative Party and another Conservative MP in BC, and out to St. John, New Brunswick, for an update out there. We've got a bit of a global angle to our story this week, the World Health Organization, and a deadline. So if you're watching this on the 7th of January, there is still time today to sign the petition from Canadians who are concerned about a World Health Organization panel that's being put together. We're going to talk a bit about that and provide you a link. And then we've got a little profile, not a deep dive, but a fairly notorious trans activist in Canada, Florence Ashley, is tied to that UN panel, and we're going to give a little bit of a glimpse of some of Florence Ashley's policies. And then I think we're going to try a deep dive this week a little bit on some New Year's thinking and an existential crisis that lots of us go through at this time of year, end of year, one year, beginning of another. What am I doing? Where are we going? What's this all about? And so we're gonna jump from there. We've had some new subscribers join us over the holidays. I want to thank you for that. Melanie, what's going on?
Well, a very nice Christmas fairy sent me a new camera, so I'm using my new camera today. So if I look a little bit different, if you can see all of my flaws, it's because of this lovely new camera. So
we can see some of the details on your artwork. There's less plants in the background, or you just got a different angle.
Some around. Yeah, I've just been moving some around. They're my outdoor plants that I bring in winter. I never know where to put them, so yeah, moving around. Yeah, nothing much more exciting than that. But yeah, anyone who joined, yes, thank you for joining, thank you for subscribing. all the subscribers help boost the channel, help us bring some Canadian gender news to more people. So yeah, thank you very much. Please feel free to share some of the episodes. Feel free to share some of the clips of the episodes that we put out there. That would be really helpful. Thank you very much.
We're diving right in this week with familiar story of Nicholas Cepeda, aka Melanie Wiseheart, the swimmer who's been competing in girls' swim competitions. And there's a call out if you're anywhere near Orillia, January 19, 20, and 21. Nicholas Cepeda is competing again in swim competitions. He's been changing in girls' change rooms. He's been swimming with girls as young as 13 in competition. He's not a good swimmer. And I think the way that this works is it's based on your times. So he's such a bad swimmer, he's being slotted in with girls in the girls' competition rather than adults. So the call out here, if you're near Orillia that week, January 19, 2021, to join in some protests there. I'm getting tired of giving this guy airtime. I hope that there's actually a good turnout for this, and the pressure that he's been getting is going to lead to some changes in swimming. So April Hutchinson, this was put up as a victory. There was an appeal to her 2-year suspension and the controversy over her criticizing Anne Andres, who's a male powerlifter who's been competing against her. And she got a year taken off of her 2-year suspension. Not really a victory because this shouldn't have happened at all. But April expressed some positive sentiment on Twitter about this news that's come out. And I think that there's been some adherence or compliance with the National Powerlifting Association to be adhering to international guidelines for lifting instead of Canadian law, which has kind of been where the conflict is around human rights.
I don't think we have it in our presentation or in the slides this week, but or maybe correct me if we do, but Eva Kurilova pointed out a white paper that went to Ottawa, to the Parliament, to review, and in there was some talk about, or some recommendations around sport, around the government becoming more involved in regulating the gender identity issue in sport. Because as far as I understand right now, a lot of that's done by the sporting organizations. So for Cepeda, for example, that would be I think it's Swim Ontario. But the suggestion in there, and I apologize to everyone that I don't think I added this, but yeah, it's worth going to read. Let's see if we'll put maybe the link to the white paper in the description. But it seems there seems to be a bit more of a push to get the government more involved in actually regulating these things directly. So we'll see. So I guess in a sense, these sorts of things with April Hutchinson, although you're right, Shannon, it should never have happened, but it did. The fact that some of that time has been shortened maybe is an indication of public opinion. So I guess we just have to take the victories when they come, really.
Indeed, yeah. White paper recommendations. I just want to pull that up because I want to give viewers a little bit of context. This is a white paper put forward by an NDP MP from Vancouver Island, if I'm not mistaken, Randall Garrison. This is really a whole. He has a trans-identified person, a staffer working for him, who drafted up this document to bring to the House of Commons. So it's completely ideological. It's called the White Paper on the Status of Trans and Gender Diverse People, Randall Garrison MP, Esquimalt, Saanich, and Suk. Principal researcher is Delana Thompson, she, her. There has been some call to get motivation to criticize this as or before it goes up and to mobilize some energy. And some of the back channels are seeming to suggest just don't say anything about this and let it die. an NDP bill at this point like this likely isn't going to go through. It's quite extreme, and if it does get close to, we've got to go through first reading, second reading, third reading, then it's got to go to the Senate for approval. So it's pretty far from reality at this point. But you can't put anything past the trans activists or rule anything out. If it gets a little more interesting, we'll cover some of the details on that white paper with our viewers. All right, out to British Columbia. BC is really, we know that they're deeply entrenched in gender ideology. SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity 123 is the program. Has been in BC schools for about 6 years. And it's really caught the attention of a lot of parents now. And more people are coming out on a regular basis, so much so that they were doing 24-hour protests over the Christmas holidays. I don't know if they're still doing 24 hours, but they've been out every single day, and many of those days, or most of them, twice in different locations, and trying to raise awareness out there about what's happening in schools.
Yeah, I don't have much time. These guys are just so dedicated. Not only have they been protesting on a daily basis, but the idea that they then started being 24/7, I thought that was, the thing is about you guys, I'm just going to say, if any of you are listening, the level of dedication is beyond anything that I could possibly even dream of having myself. And it's a shame that this isn't being covered more. You guys are pretty impressive, very, very impressive. And every time I feel like you're doing something really impressive, somehow you come out with something even more impressive to top that off. So we should take a lot of inspiration from these guys. Well done, Abbotsford.
Absolutely.
Good job.
They're showing the rest of the country how it's done, and also giving an indication of just how far BC has gone to generate that much pushback. Now, one of the things to top this, or to indicate that it's really moving in the right direction, Bruce Banman and John Rustad, Conservative MP and the leader of the Conservative Party in BC. Now, they don't have a lot of seats in the legislature. BC has been left and far left for a long, long time. But they came out to the protests and shared some words of encouragement with protesters, and congratulations for taking the initiative in a democratic country to speak and criticize the government and do it peacefully and do it in the name of loving children. So there's a clip that you can watch if you wanted to track it down of John Rustad's speech to the people who've come out.
I'm always in two minds about politicians going to protests. It's always really nice when you feel like you have politicians on your side. That certainly felt nice seeing some politicians at the parents' protest this summer. There's no doubt. I think that's nice. But then there's always this feeling of seeing politicians then counter-protesting you or stuff like that. So I don't know. I'm always in two minds. Yeah. It's nice to see that some of them are listening. I know from my experience, some people that I know have been trying to talk to politicians. They don't necessarily listen. So it's nice to see that maybe some of them are paying a bit more attention. But yeah, I'm always in a little bit, I don't know. I do question, maybe this is my existential 2024 thinking around this, but.
Yeah, we talked a bit about that last week in our year-end review, and we've got a bunch of sliced segments there of the big stories that we thought really dominated in themes for 2023. One of them was this issue where politicians were coming out and were protesting. And I see a little distinction here with Rustad and Banman, because they're out at the protest and they're supporting the protesters, but they're not protesting. They're saying, we're hearing you, we appreciate your voices and that you're speaking out, we recognize your concerns. I think that's incredibly important for politicians to do. But when you're leading the parade and when you're carrying the banners or the megaphone, this reminds me.
That was a very violent megaphone. Apparently, it got engaged in some physical assaults and all.
Well,
sure.
it's that megaphone is costing Joel Harden money now. So if you don't remember the story, last June, Joel Harden, who's an MPP here in Ottawa, was out at the June 9th protest when Billboard Chris and Josh Alexander came to town and claimed that he got punched in the face and he had a cut on his cheek. And very quickly, an image came out of Joel Harden with a megaphone, and the megaphone, there was a little sort of clip or something on the megaphone that lined up exactly with this cut that he had on his cheek. And so, there was a lot of skepticism there with Joel Harden, but he and his microphone got a $490 fine last week here in Ottawa for noise bylaw violations. Joel Harden's been out protesting with the pro-Palestinian anti-Israel groups, as have a number of the other sort of regulars here. And again, these are politicians leading the parade. Instead of listening to constituents, they've become part of the protest. And that's, I get where your discomfort is there, Melanie, because I share it.
I'm just trying to take more of a 30,000-foot view, a high-level view, and just looking at things and observing things and finding how I personally feel about it. I mean, I think you have a point about this distinction between leading the charge from the very front and potentially getting to understand the opinions and thoughts of the people on the ground. I mean, there might be a distinction there too, but
well, I mean, there's another way of dealing with protesters, and that's you run away to the cottage and you call them bigots and wife beaters, and
there is that.
Yeah, probably misogynists and racists. Yeah,
probably.
And just ignore them entirely. Okay, so out to the East Coast. This was an interesting article in CBC that came to my attention today. It came out on January the 3rd, and it's a long and fairly nuanced piece. And I haven't read the writer before. He's been with CBC in New Brunswick for decades. Jacques Poitras.
Close enough.
Close enough. Okay. So Jacques interviewed a Muslim man, Mohammed Bakash. Here, I'm really struggling with the pronunciations today, who was at the September 20th protests. And Jacques played an interesting and nuanced analysis because, especially since October 7th, we've seen real, strange lines drawn in the all around us. Things were really black and white before October 7th and polarized. And in a weird way, October 7th drew kind of new lines. And instead of being, black and white poles, there now seems to be different camps. So there are gender criticals who are, anti-Israel, and
the divisions were further divided into subdivisions.
Yeah. This was an interesting piece. It was about new immigrants coming to Canada. It was about should Canadian, this stuff in Canadian education be part of the kind of conformity required of new immigrants? Are we not respecting their culture then? If we're teaching Soji and alienating them potentially from their children? It was worth a read, and it's unusual for CBC. I don't want to say it was totally balanced, but it's unusual for CBC to go to that level of nuance in my experience, especially around the gender issue. And this is a photo taken from the pro rainbow side of the demonstrations. And note we were just talking about politicians, and Blaine Higgs was there talking to concerned parents about Policy 713, which has generated all of the controversy in his province, or as the flashpoint. The march was one of several held across Canada under the slogan of parents' rights. Now, I lost count, but there were dozens of cities across the country where thousands of people came out to protest, and we had tens of thousands. I was trying to think of an example over the last week of a larger nationally coordinated or organic protest in Canada that had ever happened on any issue, but certainly for parents. I can't, not in my lifetime do I remember anything like September the 20th and the size and scope and scale of that pushback around what's going on in schools.
I mean, maybe the trucker convoy, but that was different. It was just organized differently, but it was probably maybe larger. I don't know, but my understanding is this was the largest protest of its kind and probably the first parallel. I don't know if you could call it like a national but parallel protest.
It was funny with the union leaders trying to figure out how our high tech coordinated systems were working. And that
Our
we were so we were so
I
coordinated
love that.
they couldn't even infiltrate us because
That was my favorite. That was my absolute favorite listening to it. How it was these fascists. They're so organized. They've gone beyond our normal ability to oversee them. They're just so they just could not comprehend in their heads that this could just be regular parents who are independent all over the country, who had the same goal, but were organizing in their own different ways with their own groups of people on, I mean, the most basic of platforms. We're talking, Facebook groups, we're talking WhatsApp groups, we're talking nothing high tech here.
yeah,
It's just a bunch of
just
people
Discord
amongst themselves.
servers. Yeah,
Coordinating themselves. It was, there could not be a more organic, grassroots uh, event, I think, probably in Canadian history, except for maybe the trucker convoy. But I wasn't part of that, so I can't really comment on it. I'm just saying that from an outside observer. But yeah, I thought that was interesting. And I think a lot of that view is from the perspective that they are funded, they are centrally organized, they are telling other people what to protest, where to go, these are the materials. But that's not,
yeah,
they just could not comprehend that wasn't at all what the Million March was. And I think there's a propaganda piece that came out this week from, I think it was Press Progress or something like that. And they essentially in there were saying that the Million Marches were Christian white supremacist movement that was highly funded. And I mean, this could not have been more of a propaganda piece. It's a shame we don't have it here, but it was a very funny piece. They just don't have any idea what it is that they're fighting, I think.
The other side of that one is that they are using the specter of a white supremacist boogeyman to rile up their supporters, to grift money.
Potentially, I mean, could be
Press
propaganda. That's the
Press
other way of
progress
looking at it.
is a rag, and it's part of the news laundering cycle here in Ottawa.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was an obvious propaganda, no doubt. But I think a lot of people really do believe this stuff. They really don't have any idea what it is that they're fighting against at all, not even slightly.
Yeah. Just Dad 7, who's retired now. Just Dad is a lawyer, and his icon avatar is George Orwell. He's a great thread writer, and if you don't follow Just Dad 7 and you're on Twitter, you really should. He did a fantastic year-end summary, more international than what Melanie and I did. It's worth bookmarking and having a look at it. Just, I love the context of seeing what's happened in a year. So he was talking about this issue I mentioned early in the episode, that if you're watching on Sunday the 7th, you have time to sign a petition to send a message to the UN that has put together this panel of trans activists to develop guidelines on how to deal with the needs of trans and gender diverse people.
Yeah, the medical needs and psychological needs. Yes.
Yeah. And some of them were there's 2 Canadians on the panel. There's 21 positions, so 10% of the influence is Canadian. One is a UBC professor, and another is a lawyer. So it's coming out of, I say the lawyer, Florence Ashley is actually an associate or assistant professor at the University of Calgary as well. We're going to talk a little bit about him. So this is our friend Flo. I've heard Florence Ashley's name quite a lot, Melanie, but I've never really looked into him. Read a couple of articles and just shook my head, and but kind of a deep end trans activist.
Yeah, I actually hadn't heard of them before up until just recently. They were a new name, so I, out of curiosity, went and looked into them a little bit. I mean, actually, so Redux, as you can see here, put out recently, I think it was a few days ago. Oh, it was today, an article on what this person has proposed and what they put forward previously. And in the article, it says that I think it's Florence Ashley has apologies for the poor title. It's Florence Ashley's title, but the title of this paper in 2019 is Thinking and Ethics of Gender Exploration Against Delaying Transition of Transgender and Gender Creative Youth. And in there, Ashely claims that allowing children to go through unmitigated puberty constitutes a larger risk to children than placing them on drugs, which suppresses their natural development. So it says, although taking puberty blockers is a form of medical treatment, it certainly facilitates exploration significantly more than letting puberty run its course. Whereas puberty strongly favors cis embodiment by raising the psychological and medical toll of transitioning. Puberty blockers structurally place transgender and cisgender hormonal futures in an approximate symmetry. Youth who take puberty blockers have their options wide open, their bodies unaltered by either testosterone or estrogen, Ashely states. So the gist here is that because of the concept of cis sexism, which is that the assumption that people are not trans, that we have to, as a matter of ethics, put children on puberty blockers before they reach any kind of change in pubertal development, because that's the ethical thing to do. And it gives them time to really explore their gender identity. And Ashley recognizes that this is a medical treatment, and yet still sees this as some kind of progressive, morally right, or the better thing to do rather than allow natural development. So that's a really hot take from Ashely.
He calls himself a bioethicist.
Yes.
And this is the ethics of transhumanism, really.
Yes, and it is the entire opposite of do no harm, the entire opposite of not intervening when there's nothing wrong. I mean, that's the basis of the Hippocratic Oath.
Indeed. Again, if you're watching this on the 7th Sunday, the 7th of January, sign the petition. We'll put it in the link because Florence Ashley is one of the 2 Canadians on this panel, 21 people. It's an activist panel, and they're developing guidelines for global policy from the UN on transgender care for minors. A number of these people were involved in the WPATH, that's the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, Standards of Care 7 and 8. So they've had inputs into a highly questionable policy and influence before. And as the rest of the world seems to be reaching a point of seriously questioning these policies of medicalizing and affirming trans children, this is getting run up the flagpole at the UN, and then coming from a top-down approach in a supranational kind of way. So ideally, we send a message to the UN. Our Duty Canada and Our Duty International was putting together a briefing on this to submit as well. I know that other jurisdictions, that people from all over the world are actually aware of this in the gender critical space and mobilizing to give inputs onto how this panel is coming together. While I'm on this, I've set aside my day tomorrow. I've got to do a write-up on our artificial intelligence project that we started in late 2022. I say we had a panel of international advisors and donors. We put together enough money to create a customized AI to deploy into Twitter and Reddit. Our goal was to try and understand peer-mediated influence online, social contagion. And a couple of years ago, that was, I think, was the biggest question that we could have asked at the time. And some of the prevailing theory in books like Deborah So and in Helen Joyce's book and in others was that kids were learning about transgenderism online, and it was a social contagion mediated by social media use. And it wasn't as apparent at the time just how pervasive this influence was in education. So I'm putting together some analysis of this. And one of the big early takeaways was that the influence online doesn't seem to be coercive. And there are, of course, the Jeffrey Marshes of the world. There are the Jeffrey Marshes of the world who's constantly inviting kids to reach out to him, calling himself a personal coach. And what's the other thing that he does? Oh, yeah, he talks about going no contact if parents don't automatically affirm you. And in his really kind of gross voice, trying to soothe children, to getting in touch with him, and he holds it's come out that he holds private spaces online for to have chat rooms with kids and things like this, which is really quite vile. But there are three types of major influence that we learned right away. And the first one was legal influence. So the biggest influencers on Twitter were lawyers. Ashely is an example. These are policy people. These are activists who have learned enough about the legal space and legal mechanisms to be able to create policy and implement policy and then fight for policy. So one of the big examples is Alejandro Caraballo,
yeah.
from Harvard Law, who practices in technology law but uses legal expertise to fight. Now, the second one was medical, and this was medical advocacy. So not necessarily trans people. Jack Turbin's a good example. Jack Turbin, I've referred to him as the Butcher of Stanford. He's one of the biggest influencers in the medical space in North America, promoting trans-affirming care and transition for children. My daughter, when I asked my daughter about potential regret or side effects or detransition, she sent me an interview with Jack Turbin, who said that it was talking about a report that 13% of people who transitioned detransitioned. That's 1 in 8. And I asked my daughter before, at that time, I said, is 1 in 8, if you're making irreparable changes to your body, is 1 in 8 good odds? And Jack Turbin's response to this, well, that's all just part of the gender journey. Like this is just fine that we're going to have a 13% regret rate and detransition rate, and those have been buried. Now, what's the nickname for Jack Turbin? Quack Jack. I've heard people calling him. So we've got unethical and Jordan Peterson calls them liars and butchers. People in the medical field, legal field, medical field. You want to take a guess at what the third one is, Melanie? I don't know if I've told you this before.
Don't think you have. So we've got law, we've got medicine.
Fiction.
So like entertainment. Would that include, I don't know, like films and television?
It's more writers.
Writers.
Trans writers writing about trans characters. And that ties and connects right into the fandoms.
I was going to say, that sounds like fanfic.
Yeah, a lot of fan fiction. When I did this sample development for the AI, I manually researched and verified about 300 accounts, half being trans-identified males, trans-identified females, very, very distinct and different patterns in those sample sets. And overwhelmingly, patterns that were obvious in the trans-identified females, and my daughter is a good example of this, is fan art, fan fiction, fan writing, a lot of animation and graphic design, and creativity, which suggests a creative and open kind of shared characteristics. But the fan fiction writers in transgender influence are the third big category. And the rest are, quite a bit lower in their dominance. So when we see people like Florence Ashley, to me, that automatically slots into, okay, there's a legal advocate.
Well, they're a legal influencer in the bioethics, like in medicine, like that is, and not only medicine, trans medicine, that's their speciality. That's where they're targeted. So that's
Yeah.
2 of 3.
Yeah. And I suspect if we looked at the panel and looked at the individuals on the panel, and I went through it enough to analyze who's from Canada on that and kind of count up the number of people. But there's a brief bio of all of the characters involved.
Well, the thing about the thing about this particular panel or this push. So I think the time to put in some kind of pushback is tomorrow. You're right. That's the end. But the actual panel gets together in February, I believe. I think it might have been February 16th. I could be wrong on the exact date. But the point is, Dad did point out that the window to be able to put in a letter or some kind of objection, whatever, it is quite short, and it's not very well publicized. And apparently, so I'm not a legal person, but apparently this is very uncommon. And according to Dad, he believed that this was possibly done on purpose to, as we see with a lot of trans stuff, it's to kind of like slip it under the radar, right?
Yep.
So you do things based on rules, and we all have to follow rules, and sometimes rules are annoying, but you can sort of bend the rules a little bit in your favor, and that seems to be pretty common with everything that has to do with pushing so-called trans care or trans. Frankly, it is an ideology, trans ideology, right? How do you get it in? Well, you kind of slip it under the radar. So that's happened with this particular WHO panel as well. So
it's part of the playbook.
Difficult. And for example, well, this is the thing. It makes it difficult for people like you and I we have other jobs. We have other things to do. Just add all the other people looking into this, Howard Duty, they're all parents who have other jobs. And so when you have a short window, it means that there's not a lot of time for the people to be able to look into who's on the panel, look into what they're writing. I think the document on the UN for this particular get together was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long. I mean, there's a lot to go through in a very short amount of time to be able to give a well-argued objection, if that be the case, right? And so I'm just exasperated. I think that's the point of it. I would probably agree. I tried to go through some of this stuff. I like to read the documents. I like to read the source material. I like to read the policies. And I found that overwhelming. There's just so much to look into, from understanding the individuals and where they're coming from, understanding the UN documentation that they put out for the upcoming panel, what it is that they're covering. It's a lot. And I think I became aware of this, last week. So well done for Our Duty for putting something together, people coming together and doing something, because it really was not a lot of time for people to put the work in.
It was only a couple, maybe 3 weeks at the outside was the sort of feedback period on this. And it was, so we talked about the Dentons document in the summertime, and I know you had a chance to look at that. For viewers who are unfamiliar, Dentons brands itself as the largest law firm in the world. It's a Chinese-owned firm. All the senior partnership is Chinese. They have branches all over the world. And Dentons was commissioned to do a report about trans policy and implementing trans affirming or trans positive legal policy in jurisdictions around the world. They wrote the playbook, and it was commissioned by three major...
They wrote the playbook. They wrote the activist playbook, how to get this into your laws.
Yep, and how to get it...
How even the playbook on how to create or manufacture what appears to be a grassroots movement. I mean, if you haven't had a chance to read the Dentons document, please do. You will be shocked at what you actually see when you believe this is grassroots.
Somehow organic or grassroots. Yeah, it's not. So it's coming from, as I said, the legal, the medical, and then the fiction writers who are sort of seducing people into fantasy worlds about role playing and LARPing. LARPing is live action role play for I had to look that one up when I heard it a couple of times. But basically, Florence Ashley is LARPing a woman. He's live action role playing a woman. And that thing comes from video games or from, Civil War reenactment kind of scenarios. part of the Dentons playbook is to slip trans policies uh, in omnibus bills. So an omnibus bill is a bill containing a whole bunch of different types of legislative policies, and to kind of bury it at the bottom so that it doesn't get any scrutiny. And just like DEI, which has seen an incredible amount of publicity and media in the last 10 days because of what happened at Harvard, to use language that seems very nice and hard to question. So gender affirming care is a euphemism. It sounds positive. Okay, well, we need to affirm people's gender because that's a human right. But what it really means is, stopping the puberty of children, permanently altering their bodies, putting them on a track to irreversible surgeries and a lifetime of sexual dysfunction, et cetera, et cetera. So the Dentons document was the playbook for this. And it's actually not as easy to find as it used to be. I know that you and I have PDF copies that we were able to download, but I think the links to the Dentons site are no longer.
Yeah, I went to have a look recently out of curiosity, and I couldn't find it. I do have a copy, if anybody needs a copy. But yeah, that's the other thing. So this document was covered by Graham Linehan and a lot of much more influential people who did I don't know, deep dives or explorers on the Denton document. So it's not like it's not out there. The information is not out there. But I think this is my view, that they understood that it was getting a little bit too much heat. And so they made it unavailable or hard to find. I can't find it online personally at the minute. So that tells you something, that not only does it give you the playbook, but this playbook did receive a lot of attention. And now you can't find it. Now we can't find it. And we know that activists, a lot of this stuff is openly accessible. You can find a lot of the information that Shannon and I talk about. It's not hidden. I mean, sometimes we do get leaks, but for the most part, these policies, these ideas are very available publicly. So for that to no longer be available is really an interesting point for the Dentons document.
The whole thing about deconstructing gender and erasing biological sex, and it sounds very conspiratorial, and the underhanded and shady way that these policies have been deliberately put in place in countries all over the world is shady and manipulative. It's designed so that they don't get questioned on the way into becoming policy, and once and to have it entrenched in law and then make it very hard to change. So, the gay liberation movement was very organic. It was gays and lesbians, from all walks of life wanting to be more, and it was grassroots. It was, street level. It was, coordinated from individuals who built up organizations from the ground, like EGAL, prior to 2011, when they were taken over by trans activists. Was such an organization, had a very important role, came from the grassroots, but these tactics now used by trans activists are developed by a Chinese owned and controlled law firm to subvert our laws and to do so in a way that people aren't going to recognize the negative implications until they've already been laws for years. One of the major donors who funded that research project is the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Thomson is a Canadian oligarch family, a billionaire family here in Canada. Reuters is a media organization, and the foundation is sort of the charitable arm of the Thomson group. Thomson owns the Globe and Mail and owns other major media. Reuters is a wire service delivering information. And so, if they're trans positive or gender positive, and they were paying for the strategies to implement this it's hard not to get conspiratorial sometimes on what is the influence behind this? Where's the money coming from? And like I said, one of the major donors, a big Canadian billionaire dynasty.
I didn't know that about the Thomson Reuters. That's something I learned today.
Yeah. Does that Does it help our existential crisis, Melanie, or does it?
No, it really doesn't. It really doesn't. I keep asking myself, what the hell are we doing? What the hell, is this even helpful? I mean, what you've just described is true. I've read the Dentons, right? A little while back. I have read multiple policies. I've read this white paper that just came in. I like to go when there's information being presented. I like to actually go read the source material, because that's where you find some really interesting stuff. And I've done my own academic reading on lots of different papers, whatever. So, but when we say it, when we express it to people, when I'm hearing back what I'm saying to others, or when I sometimes hear back what you're saying, if I think about where I was 2 years ago, it sounds stupid. It sounds crazy. Those people really are going down a right-wing extremist pipeline. They've really lost the plot. This is all conspiracy theory. And isn't that convenient that the Dentons document is no longer available online? Maybe it doesn't exist. There's all this way of looking at it. And it sometimes I wonder, well, there you go. There's the Dentons document.
We have
it
the
does
Dentons
exist.
document.
And anybody who wants to read it, please get in touch. But, I hear these things and I often wonder, we learn about anyone who comes into gender or any other intersectional topic, whether it's anti-racism, decolonial, all this stuff. If you're not already indoctrinated into it, or you wake up to it and you start looking at the roots of it, the ideological roots, whatever, or some of the progress that has been made within the law, within medicine, all these things, you understand there's so much corruption, and it's difficult to understand. Is that a question of, well, it just so happens that that this happened over time? Is there somebody pulling the strings? What is going on? And our politicians are not doing anything about it, or don't seem to be. Our media is not, doesn't appear to be covering things in a fair manner. And it makes it really difficult for the average citizen. And we hear a lot about citizen journalists who are going out there and sharing misinformation. But if information is not reliable, and you know that from your experience because you are reading these things, and it is not being addressed in a factual manner, what do people do? Anyway, I'm going off on topic. This is my existential 2024 crisis. How do we know, how do we even address these issues? How do we make a difference? How do we, bring society back into, sense, reason, rational thinking, being able to talk to one another, to be able to come to mutual understanding amongst us all, so we're no longer fighting? This is my 2024. Those are the big questions that I'm wrestling with.
Yeah, well, documents like this Dentons piece don't really help. I mean, I think what they tell us is that there are very significant and powerful forces that want to muddy the waters. They have created deliberate subterfuge and manipulation, and then when you can tie media conglomerates to that kind of effort, it really raises questions about what's the role of the United Nations if they're coming up with this.
Because recently there's talk about Canada removing itself from the United Nations, and of course, predictably, the more liberal-minded people are up in arms. What do these people think they're doing, these stupid conservatives? But that's probably a good idea at this point. The UN has definitely showed itself, or these unelected international organizations have definitely shown themselves to be untrustworthy, having their own agendas, which they're clearly not sharing in an open and honest fashion. And it begs the question, if they have influence and they're influencing all these countries, certainly the West, without a shadow of a doubt, where does that lead us? I mean, right now it's led us into this so here we talk about gender, so we can focus on gender, but it's definitely taking us into a place where it seems the push is for all children now to be sexless individuals who cannot reproduce in the future because they've been put on medicalized pathways. Why? That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And yet we're not allowed to discuss that in any kind of fashion without being called a transphobe or a bigot or a cis-sexist or all these names, and that's a playbook that we've seen over and over. Well, we saw it in the 1960s and 70s revolutionaries in the New Left with Herbert Marcuse's influence of not tolerating anything to the right, or Theodore Adorno's idea of calling everything to the right of you fascist. So we're seeing all of this stuff come up again. Anyway, again, I'm going on another rant, but I think a lot of this is...
We talked earlier, and it took me a while to figure out a definition of fascism. And you articulated it quite well.
Well, it's when you take industry and you meld it with government. That is what fascism is. It is the marriage of industry and government as one. So it is one unit. That's essentially what we have in the West right now.
Yeah, the word comes from...
we talk, and I'm just going to say, we keep saying that the West is capitalist, and I would go as far as to say that that's not true. The West is much more of a fascist economic system than it is a capitalist one. We don't have free markets. I don't think people understand what a free market is.
Yeah, you've thrown that at a 23-year investment advisor, so I'm going to turn that around in my head for a bit.
Please explain it, Shannon. I don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, okay, so fascism, the root of the word comes from sheaf or sheaf of wheat. So a sheaf or a sheaf of wheat is a bundle of wheat, right? And then when those bundles get tied together, actually the symbol for fascism is a bundle of wheat. And it is the binding, as you said, of, you say industry, and I think it was fair to use that terminology in the 30s in Germany because, but I think it's more like, it's more like corporations and economic power.
It's the economic power is the same as the state.
Yeah. And when that happens, there's nothing that's advocating on behalf of the people. And the government is basically acting in concert and collusion with the forces of capital and the forces of industry in order to create that's what we have society. Now. I think that there is some unholy connection between between corporations and state, and at a global scale. Yeah. So fascism is a top-down approach. If I may be getting that wrong, but more of a top-down
it has to be.
Control structure, authoritarian, and to a certain, that's the other thing. It's authoritarian, and we're seeing two authoritarian movements today. Similarly to the two major authoritarian movements we saw in the 30s, and one is communism. That's coming from the ground up, and from the academy. Yeah. And then we're seeing kind of this global, the UN being a sort of, it's not a governmental organization. It's not supposed to have legislative or control powers over sovereign nations. But a few years ago, our prime minister said Canada is becoming the world's first post-nation state. So what exactly does that say about our governance? We're getting a bit more philosophical in today's episode, as if you're listening. And there are the question I think that we all have to ask is, how much freedom have we given up, has been taken away from us? And how much more are we willing to see taken away? I think we saw unnecessarily in the pandemic that a certain amount of our freedoms were limited, especially early on when we did not understand the risks.
Beyond that, I would take it further. Beyond that, what we've seen is not only can they be, but they will be, and we have no control over what freedoms can get taken away, and how you can crush the movement of people saying, we want our freedoms back. That whole concept of freedom has been turned into a right-wing dog whistle, like somehow this is fascism, which freedom is the complete antithesis of any kind of authority. That's the antithesis. And in my understanding of the West, as it were, is that it is founded on the concept of individual liberty. And we've completely painted that as some kind of immoral thing to want and some kind of evil force. And when your people believe that, when a lot of people seem to believe that, what hope is there? So people championing this idea of people calling out fascism all the time and say, oh, this is fascist, that's fascism, when we're talking about morality, and yet demanding more and more authoritarian control over their lives and denouncing other people who are saying, maybe that's not such a great
government
idea.
intervene and supporting corporations who are participating in the whole thing. Yeah,
yes, that worries me a lot.
You said something earlier that I did stick in my mind, is that it's not right versus left, or it is authoritarian versus freedom.
Yes, that's where I think we are. We always talk about liberals versus conservatives or left versus right. And, politically, it's become pretty clear to me that it really is a question of whether you believe that individuals have the inalienable right to liberty, or you believe that individuals are part of a collective and should be controlled by an authoritarian body. And I don't think most people really frame it that way. We think we live in this democracy and that the constitutional monarchy of Canada is like it always was. But, there's been so many movements of socialist movements in Canada that I don't even think we realize how far down the pipeline of socialism Canada's gone. And we see socialism some kind of it's a lovely thing, and it has done some nice things. I mean, it's helped people live longer and it's had some benefits. But don't forget that when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto and all of his works, he did point out that communism is the last stage. The very last stage is communism. That is when everybody is under this perfect utopia of equality. But to get there, they even stated that you couldn't get people to want to go through all of that to get to collectivism. So you had to have stages. And one of those stages is socialism. It's just one of the stages towards communism. And the end goal is that full authoritarian state that controls everything. So I think people forget that. They forget that it might have worked for a while, but now we're advancing that and it's becoming pretty scary. We're seeing all this division. You can look at the history of the politics that's been an interest of mine for a little while now, because I realize we really don't understand communism and the ideology behind that. But it's really interesting. It's kind of been going on for the last, 140 years or so. And so you forget that previous generations had a lot more liberty than we do. And the previous generation to that had a lot more liberty. And I didn't even realize up until recently that we didn't even have birth certificates up until, maybe it was the 1920s or 30s. Right? You didn't need them.
Our names were in the church record, right? They were in the birth registry at the church, basically son of or daughter of, and the parents' names were registered in whatever. That's how you track genealogy, is to go back to church records as opposed to birth certificate systems. And we didn't have a tax system until...
Taxes, yeah.
Yeah.
You think that these are things that have always been in place. We've always paid income tax. We've always paid... taxes on goods. We've always done this, but the truth of the matter is we haven't. And incrementally over time, we've accepted more and more and more control over our lives, and it becomes normalized, I think. And so it doesn't.
Absolutely.
It's not without the realms of possibility to then accept even more control, because it's the more control you give to a governing body, the more you become dependent on that governing body, and it becomes, you're not taking responsibility for your own life. If you're not taking responsibility for your own life and your own liberty, because every right has a responsibility, so with all liberty comes with responsibility, then it's just so much easier to give more and more and more away. And I feel like that's what I'm seeing. And we don't teach this in school. We teach about fascism. We teach about the Third Reich. There's so many documentaries on I guess there's some on the communist takeovers of Stalin and Mao, but we don't really truly learn anything about the history of socialism and the ideology behind that, and at all. We just don't understand. And it's not like it doesn't exist. It's out there. Anyone can read it. This is definitely not conspiracy theory. I'm reading books on it. This is public information, but we're not taught this. And anyway, that's a bit of a rant here, but that's been on my mind a lot. Is how do we recognize where we are, and how do you get people to really look at it, not as left and right, but do you believe that you as an individual are part of a collective system and must give up your individual liberty to that system? Or do you believe that we're all individuals and we work alongside, but not, well, together is maybe not the right way of looking at it, but I don't know. Is this any of this making sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've been, over the last year, I have been reading a lot about mass movements, mass psychosis. The new term that we had from a writer and academic from, I want to say he's from Denmark, Matthias Desmet.
I think he's Belgian.
Belgian. Okay. Yeah. He wrote a book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism, or something
Great
like
book.
that.
Yeah.
Yep. And his description for the phenomena is mass formation psychosis, or simply mass formation. And there were a whole bunch of books starting in the late 1940s through the end of the 1950s. And then another one that came out, actually didn't get published until 1997 or 1998, called Political Ponerology. Carl Jung wrote about this. There was a guy who was known as the longshoreman philosopher. His name is Eric Hofer. George Orwell, of course, was writing about the manipulation of language in the totalitarian state. Aldous Huxley, two most famous ones in the fiction category that were writing about these kinds of systems. What's another one? I read a bunch of them in the last year, and one I've read 3 or 4 times in my career about investment markets, called the Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay. That was written in the 1850s about stock market bubbles and the kind of greed hysterias that had gone on. And he wrote about centuries of the phenomena. And in my world, our job is to keep our clients from making emotional mistakes and participating in the mass psychosis. So in my career, I've spent 20 years actually understanding cognitive bias and emotional reasoning, and helping people from making the kinds of classical mistakes that come along with these mass psychosis hysterias. These greed bubbles that we have in the stock market. So in our lifetimes, and to our memories, Melanie, and if you're Generation X or from the baby boom generation, you remember, of course, the technology bubble and bursting in 2001, 2002, the crash of the NASDAQ, if Canadians, the crash of Nortel Networks and JDS Uniphase. And they were the two biggest stocks, almost 50% of the Toronto Stock Exchange at one point. And then the global housing crisis of 2007 through 2009. Those were emergent of greed phenomena that were, and in the finance world, we call them systemic risks and contagions. They're psychic contagions that possess people and infect institutions. They corrupt institutions on a systemic basis. So the greed takes a hold, people bend the rules, and these institutions collapse. The stock markets crash. People lose a lot of money. And get back to real basics and fundamentals. And I've come to believe that the situation that we're seeing now is a type of mass psychosis, or a mass formation, mass hysteria around diversity, equity, inclusion, around the gender issue, around calling everybody fascism. We've got this polarization that's happening, that it's a bubble that has infected systems and institutions. Perhaps what's happened in the last week with the resignation of Claudine Gay from Harvard, under the scandal of plagiarism and her response to anti-Jewish hatred on campus, is a symbol of the bursting of the bubble.
Maybe, but this mass psychosis, if it's a mass psychosis, then it's happened all of a sudden, no? Because
No,
it takes Okay.
So like Nazism was a mass psychosis.
The playbook for this has been going on quite some time. I would say probably 80 years. The playbook for some of the attitudes that we see today.
That's exactly right. And you hit on something that's really interesting, and it's central to just about every single book that I've read about this. save maybe the fiction ones, is that there's always a question: is this deliberate? Is it malfeasance? Is it
Yeah.
predatory? Is it driven by some individual or groups like Dentons who have an agenda to create this state of affairs, or
I would
is
say,
it
yeah,
emergent property of sort of people buying into a collective set of beliefs and behaving in unison around those sets of beliefs, and then the negative outcomes that manifest themselves as a consequence?
yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say it's probably 10% evil and 90% incompetence.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. People who are I've mentioned a bunch of times, I grew up in a household with a covert narcissist, as an abusive household, and unfortunately found myself in an adult relationship with one, which I've long since distanced myself from. But the question that I always ask myself was: does this person really believe the lies that they're telling, or are they deluding themselves the same way that they're deluding everybody around them? Don't know. 10% malfeasance, 90% incompetence.
Yeah, that's a different question. It's like on an individual level, that's one thing. Personality disorders, are they acquired? Are you born with them? Blah, blah, blah. But when we talk about on a societal level, right, as people become more and more seduced by bad ideas, right, and
Uh,
those bad ideas lead to bad outcomes. So we look at any kind of proper communist country. We look at we look at Soviet Russia and what happened to Soviet Russia. We look at, okay, China's doing okay now, but you could argue that's because it uses the Western capital to prop up its own communism, and even that has its own problems. And it's certainly millions of people died over that. But when you look at people adopting really bad ideas and those bad outcomes, I really, really don't think the vast majority of people doing this are evil. I think the vast majority of people are probably going about their day. So we're seeing it now, right? So individuals who just want to go to work, they just want to get their paycheck, they just want to buy their groceries that week, they just want to take their children to swimming lessons or whatever. They just want to live their lives. So they're not even interested. And then you have the people who kind of know what's going on, but again, don't want to get in trouble. So they just go along with it. And I think very few people are actually going, okay, here's an opportunity. And these people exist, right? So you have the kind of personalities who will use whatever situation to their advantage. And so they are going to manipulate things. They are going to use the divisive tactics. They are going to take advantage of somebody's vulnerabilities. That's true. But I don't think there's very many of those people. I think for the most part, and I think there's actually quite a lot of people who, we all think our ideas are good ideas. We all think that what we believe is the right thing to believe for the most part. It's very difficult for people to really change their minds about things. As as someone who has completely changed her mind, almost a 360 in my life, understanding of what my life was and what I believed in the past and what I believe now are so fundamentally different. But that is very difficult. And I've realized most people don't do that. So we all kind of have this bias that we're on the right side of history. What we're doing is the good thing. And so trans activists, even for the most part, I would believe very few of them are actually taking advantage. I think actually a lot of them believe they're doing the right thing.
I think
right?
I think some of them are careerists too. So we've created a situation in Canada with Bill C-16 going back, to the global rise of Jordan Peterson. And it started August 2016 when he testified before the Senate about the pronouns bill. And I've gone back to some of his testimony and some of his statements at the time. And he said that setting up this in law is going to give rise to a mass psychosis or a mass social contagion. And I think he was very prescient. He studied these kinds of things for decades before recognizing some of these shifts that we're going through and making predictions about where it's going. And we're at the beginning of the year and people love to make predictions. And so I think that's part of our existential crisis, because we're looking at, what's coming next. Like, are we going to get out of this? Are we going to transition through it? I'll share two theories with viewers. Theory is not the right word. Models. Okay, one model is an economic model, and as much reading as I do on this issue, I have a profession. I'm in wealth management and financial planning, so I study tax code and law and corporate structure and investment markets and economics and things like that. And I don't talk about it very much at all with in this work that I'm doing. In the podcast and in my writing about gender and whatnot. But one of the economic models is hedge fund manager, now retired, Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio was a very successful global macro hedge fund manager. So his global macro means that he's making decisions from a global geopolitical standpoint. He's looking at sovereign economies and the flows of capital around the world and the politics of individual countries. And in order to get a truly big picture view, Dalio studied centuries of economic cycles. And I mentioned an economic cycle earlier, and that's the stock market bubble cycle. And we see a stock market bubble phenomena come to surface every 7 to 10 years on average. We're way overdue for one now, by the way. Not that I'm saying the world is going to come to an end or anything, but so there's this short stock market cycle, and everyone thinks, "Ooh, the stock market's big," and that's it's really serious when the stock market has a bubble. But the bond market is known in the industry sometimes as the mighty bond market. And I've seen numbers, depending on what courses I'm reading and who I'm listening to, that the bond market, which is the debt of the world, is anywhere from 4 to 15 or 20 times the size of the stock market. Leverage is what it is. When a government needs to raise money, they issue a government bond, and very often other countries will buy those bonds to provide the liquidity. But there's this whole global economic structure of borrowing and debt, and when we really get into the philosophy of it, most of the economy that we have is built on debt,
Yes.
not on assets.
Yes.
And so Dalio identified.
We could have a whole conversation about Keynes.
Right. Dalio identified an 80 to 100 year bond market cycle. And when you mentioned earlier, it seems like this has been happening for 80 years. Well, Dalio would say from his perspective that over an 80 to 100 year period, after a significant reset, and the reset is the shifting of the global reserve currency in his analysis. So after the Second World War, the US dollar was established as the global reserve currency. Currency used to be based on the gold standard, and a dollar was linked directly to its value in gold. That was disconnected in the 1920s or so. If I remember my economic history a little bit. Post World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was a global financial order, and there was a new economic order established itself, and the U.S. became the benchmark economy for the world. And over the last 80 years, and what happens through these long debt cycles is the borrowing gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And they need
to have the debt to make economy.
Right?
Otherwise, you have to. You have to have,
But debt provides liquidity to be able to extract and process resources, which drives the economy. It's a good thing, except when it gets way out of control. And so what happens is, in order to make money more accessible and to flow more money in the system, the debt goes up, the interest rates come down, because when you lower interest rates, it means more money is accessible, it's easier and cheaper to borrow, and so more people and institutions borrow, and the debt goes up. And what's happened in the last year and a half, 2 years, our interest rates, as we're all aware of, they spiked. They spiked up to 5 plus 6%, depending what nation you're in. Some higher than that. It's caused an awful lot of pain, but it has bought us some time. And what happens, according to Dalio's model, is that there's a collapse. Before the U.S. was the benchmark currency of the world, it was the U.K. And the U.K. fought the Second World War. I mean, they were the British controlled the seas for a long, long time. They were the colonists, as the leftists love to say, the global colonial powers, and it was very costly for Europe during the Second World War, and there wasn't the foundation, the financial foundation left after World War II, and the U.S. picked up the mantle. But now the U.S. is deeply, deeply in debt, $32 trillion, $33 trillion at the moment. Canada is $1.2 trillion, and so not even in proportion to the U.S. Relative to population.
It's okay, but that's okay because we're about to have universal. Was it universal basic income? We'll just print more money. It's fine.
Well,
Don't worry about it.
that's what's happening, and the more borrowing that happens, Dalio points out that as you get to the end of the cycle, you see the rise of what he calls the redistribution people. And the redistribution people are the communists. So in the 1850s, which was 80 years before the World War II, 85, 90, what have you, before the rise of communism. In the 1850s, there was the redistribution people. And the major sort of transformational shift in North America at that time, 1850 to 1870s, was the end of slavery and the Civil War. And so there's a crisis that accompanies these major shifts. And we're in that inflection point right now. I made one of my college roommates promise that if I was ever standing on
it's not going to be redistributed. I mean, the people who truly believe
it's being redistributed now.
It's not going to be redistributed to your Aunt Sally who's in a wheelchair. It just isn't.
Well, that's what the carbon tax is.
Work.
That's what the carbon tax is. That's what universal basic income is. That's what what's the child tax credit?
But this is my point. Like, it's not okay. So you get used to this. You get dependent on this redistribution. You get dependent on the state to provide you with enough funds right now. So with the Liberals and stuff, they're just, everything's bad. Okay, don't worry. We'll give you this other tax credit. We'll give you this more money.
That's bribery.
Buying votes.
That's bribery, and it's feeding into the cycle of buying votes. Exactly, feeding into the cycle of dependency and entitlement. And the more money you give, the more entitled people are. And the more they demand. This is what I'm saying.
Like, you get to a point where I used to believe this, that, redistribution of wealth is a really good idea because all these rich people have all this money and not understanding really how the economic system is running. And so if you buy into this idea of, yes, we'll become more collectivist because then those people at the top that we already don't trust right now are suddenly going to be our benefactors and be fair with us. Like, that's not how it's happened throughout history, right? If you centralize all that power even more, they're not going to give you more money. You're just going to have less of everything. That's always how it turns out because they're not benevolent, masters who are just going to make all the right decisions. Like, that's the crux of it. So this idea of redistributing the wealth is just a fantasy.
Well, it's part of the shell game, and it leads and feeds into the crisis, and then following the crisis, there's an establishment of a new order, and lots of people are concerned about a techno-fascist order.
That almost sounds like a new world order, Shannon.
No. Actually, the term New World Order is post Second World War.
Yeah.
And the objectives of the Bretton Woods Agreement was to establish a new world order.
That's what I was saying earlier. We're going all conspiracy theory because a lot of this stuff gets put. I mean, all conspiracy theories have a core and some kind of truth at somewhere, and a lot of it might be speculation, but it comes from somewhere. These ideas are not usually propped up out of absolutely nowhere, right?
Well, sometimes. Okay, so while we're on this, we're at. I think I have a whole couple essays or podcasts that I could talk about this conspiracy theory, but there is, or the nature of conspiracy theories. There is some neurological and evolutionary mechanism that we're wired to utilize for survival that is correlated to conspiratorial thinking. And I can't remember the part of the brain, but we have this function in our brain. It's called the agency detection system. And agency means intention. Okay. So the agency detection system, if we are, we're sitting around the campfire, 10,000 BC, and there's a crash in the woods, our immediate instinctual response is that's a tiger or that's a bear or that's a wolf. That sound has intention, and our brains need to automatically assign agency to something that feels like a threat to us, because if our instinct is to dismiss the threat, then if it's a real bear or a tiger or a wolf, it's going to eat us. But lots of times it's a tree that fell down, right? It's a natural phenomena that isn't a threat. But from an evolutionary standpoint, it's better to have a false positive, a conspiracy, than to have a false negative. So this is the neurological and frankly the atheist argument against religion and against conspiracy theories. So in the 90s, I went through a whole phase. I've been a weirdo reader my whole life. I love the alien stories and who built the pyramids and the Bermuda Triangle and stuff like that.
It's fun.
It's fun, right? It's really interesting. And I went through a phase in the 90s. My roommate was really into saying that the Freemasons were the ones who were, New World Order, and they're running the world, and they're, and it's we'll call it an intuition. An intuition is a set of thoughts that isn't connected to reality. And sometimes we can have positive intuitions or confirmable intuitions. And sometimes our intuitions are delusions. And this is what happens with conspiracy thinking, is that we are in times of stress. It's very tempting for us to assign agency, which is why I like acknowledging that there's two questions. Is there someone behind this? Is there some force, or is it happening naturally? And I think that's the rational position to sit in, rather than saying, for example, like James Lindsay, Conceptual James, has been saying, and I have a ton of respect for the work that he does. He deserves a place in history for his analysis of wokeness and DEI and the Sokol type hoax that they did with the academics. But he assigns agency to all of these problems to the Gnostic cult. And the Gnostic cults were the first heresies, 1,700 years ago, that the church identified as heretical to the church, and went after the Gnostics to get rid of them because they were blasphemers and they were against God. And Lindsay says that the Gnostics went underground, and it's their influence that led to Marx and all of these a bunch of these Western philosophers, and this whole pattern of thinking has led to today, and it's all a secret Gnostic cult. And it's just like saying the Freemasons run the world, or that aliens built the pyramids.
Whatever you believe is the spiritual root or the philosophical root of the idea of conspiracy theories, the point I was trying to make is that there's something behind it. Like you said, there's a noise, right? And you maybe misattribute the reason for that noise.
And we misattribute the cause. Yeah.
And right now, there's so much censorship on information and accusations of other people, and also assumptions of other people's intent and vilification of people. And there's this culture war going on, basically, that is very divisive. There's that group. And so, and even the politicians are taking part in it. The media is taking part in this. And so it's very difficult for someone like me who, despite having been called a conspiracy theorist by my own family, I actually want to get to the root of the information. I want to find out the root of the issue. And I want to read about it. I want to analyze it. I want to assess it. I want to estimate the value of that information against the value of other information. And that's not easy to do nowadays. And I actually, I'm not anyone special, but I do have training in science. I did spend a lot of time at university, and not a Canadian or North American one. It was in science, in the UK. And so at least there was less ideological imposition in my own education. So there was an advantage of that. And so, I do understand the value of making those evaluations and actually trying as much as possible to apply reason and rational thinking and critical thinking to the information provided to you. But that's made really, really, really difficult nowadays. Not only is it made really, really difficult, what I've realized moving to North America, although it's infecting the UK a lot more now, is people mistake critical thinking for critical theory and critical theoretical
deliberately done.
you're told what to think and to base everything on that thing you're supposed to think, rather than actually evaluating lots of sources of information. Then our own politicians do this. So, I mean, I don't know, the point of what I'm trying to make is it's just really, really difficult to really have a proper understanding of what are the phenomena that are going on around us. How can we really get to grips with that? And people are not talking to one another. We're losing the ability to actually have reasoned conversations and debates. I come from a family who, in the UK, used to be able to talk about issues, and now, because I've come to an understanding that is in opposition to theirs, we're no longer able to have conversations. Yeah. I can hear the eyes rolling whenever I start talking about it, because, and I used to do this, that veil comes right over your eyes. That person, you know, I'm going to be polite to them, I'm going to be nice because I love them, but really, they've gone off the deep end, even though that individual who's rolling their eyes, and I used to do this, hasn't read it. They haven't gone looked into information. They haven't spent the time to assess that point of view, because that's the no opinion. That's the right wing. It's been labeled as this bad
the heresy,
thing.
right?
It is the heresy. Oh, I'm not supposed to think that. They think that. And it's not, I respect you enough to at least take on board what you're saying and take some interest in hearing your arguments. No, it's never that. Even though I've known you for 30 years, let's not do that. It's immediately jumping to, they've become a MAGA Republican or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
Thing that you want to,
first fascist of all, or a Nazi or
MAGA. Whatever thing. Yeah.
All the thought-stopping stuff.
In my world, it'll be, oh, you're a right winger, or you've, gone down the deep end or whatever, right? There's no grace towards trying to, and it's not just in my family. A lot of people are going through this. At some point, we've lost the ability to be able to share ideas, and not just share ideas and not just tell someone your idea, but to take the time to understand what that other person's idea is. Because we're adults. Just because you understand someone else doesn't mean you're absorbing everything they're saying to you into your own. Doesn't mean you're going to be infected by their ideas by osmosis. You use your adult humility to be able to understand where they're coming from fully, and then share your own, and then that's okay. And I don't know, I would really love it. Like, if there would be one perfect 2024 for me, is that somehow there's a light at the end of that tunnel where we're able to do that more and more in our own families and more in the public sphere.
Well, let me give you some hope, because I promised two models, right? The first model that I shared with you and viewers is the Ray Dalio, that long credit cycle, and there's a whole change in society, a collapse and big crisis that comes. The second model is from Nicholas Christakis, and Nicholas Christakis is a sterling professor of sociology at Yale. He and his wife were one of the first really high-profile mobbing / cancellations on an Ivy League campus. So in Yale in 2015, Halloween, there was an email. I mean, you can look this up on YouTube. Christakis is a medical doctor as well as a sociologist, and in his career, he's studied social contagion. He's probably the world's leading expert. And he wrote a book called, what was it called? Apollo's Arrow, about pandemics. And because he'd done research on this and on centuries of the social impact of pandemics prior to COVID, he released a book in, I want to say it was maybe late 2020, mid 2020. He was on it. And I guess when we were all locked down and the classes were canceled, he had some time. But he identified 3 significant phases of pandemic. So this ties a little bit, of course, to the period that we're in right now. And he noted, observing patterns through history, that there are these 3 phases. First one's the disease itself. It's the impact of the disease. It's how the disease spreads. It's the mortality rate. It's how people cope with isolation, quarantining, all of those types of things that we all dealt with, lockdowns, etc. And then there's a second phase, which has to do with the unclean other and the social impacts and the social responses to the unclean other. And he characterized that in part by Manichaean thinking. And Manichaeanism actually is contemporary of Gnosticism. It's a 2,000-year-old cult. And they were very black and white about the world. Good versus evil. That was the pure dichotomy. And what we have in this Manichaeanism is a hard polarization. and it's characterized by the unclean other. So during the truckers' convoy, we had 20% of Canadians who supported the truckers before the Emergencies Act was invoked, and 80% that were hysterical in opposition to the truckers as the unvaxxed, the anti-vaxxers. They're the people who are killing grandma by not complying with the rules. There's a skating video making the rounds again of a guy skating in Alberta being by himself, being arrested by police, and all the ways that society dealt with the unclean. And during the Middle Ages, there were purges. Gypsies, Jews, travelers, any minorities became scapegoats. And that's characteristic of this Manichaeanism, where a target group gets blamed, or the free-floating anxiety, to borrow Matthias Desmet's language, gets projected onto another, and the scapegoating happens. And then, we've got all kinds, like, people were torn apart in the squares. There was witch hunts, there was inquisitions, and this was all sort of slightly downstream from the disease itself, of various waves of the plague and smallpox and things that carried through society. The third phase is a liberation phase. And these follow pandemics quite predictably. So, I'm starting to hope that, just like a stock market bubble, that this intense mass psychosis, or, popular delusion, or madness of crowds, reaches a tipping point where the bubble bursts. And Christakis characterized this third phase, and I've seen him on I've seen him on CNN talk about this during the pandemic, and MSNBC. He was on Fox News. He promoted the book well and widely, and he would say his third phase is characterized by sexual licentiousness. We might see the Roaring Twenties in the gin joints and things like that. And I actually tend to think that some of post 1918 pandemic was some of the fear motivation and the purity motivation that led to prohibition of alcohol, and the whole gin joint scene of the 20s, and the can dancers and all of that stuff, and then a huge shift in society. So my hope is that we're getting past that second phase of the pandemic, and there's some, I think, positive signs happening. This past week, 10 days, has been an incredible opportunity to talk to people about DEI. And gender ideology is kind of a subset of DEI. DEI is a subset of critical theory. So, for viewers, there's critical theory, and under critical theory, there's critical race theory, there's fat studies, there's gender studies, critical feminist studies. I'm probably missing one, but the idea of critical theory, oppressor versus oppressed narrative, and we've seen some of that fraud exposed now, and there's an opportunity to have a conversation where moments ago we couldn't talk to anybody. That veil would come down, as you say, and the conversation gets shut off, and we get these automatic knee-jerk reactions. But there's kind of a crack in the armor at the moment, and it may be fleeting. It may be one little moment that's part of the bubble bursting, and we're going to see another moment in a couple of months, and another moment in a couple of months. But I think the gender bubble is bursting. We've saw huge progress last year. I think we'll continue in spite of this UN thing. Sovereign nations, I hope, are going to be able to enforce their own laws against these bizarre UN recommendations, and perhaps that panel of people is going to try and take their gender wang to emerging countries that haven't been able to develop the self-defense psychologically and legally to these kinds of machinations. So anyhow, you and I could and we do talk about this for hours and hours, Melanie.
Yeah. Well, we just live in such a crazy world right now, and it's, I think a lot of people, well, I did anyway, when you notice there's something wrong, and I think a lot of people notice there's something wrong. Different people have different approach. My approach is, okay, what the hell is wrong? I need to go find out. I need to go find the answer, go read stuff, but we have to explore ideas. I think it's really important to share how we understand the world. Like you and I understand the world from very different perspectives, and I think hearing other people's perspective helps form our own. So I thought that was really interesting. We don't normally go off gender topic too often, but we did today. So
once in a
I
while,
hope that
it was an existential crisis.
It was an existential crisis. Hopefully no more. Hopefully we can get back on track following the wins in the gender game over 2024, building on the wins of the gender culture war in 2023. I think that's good. So just a reminder to anyone still having made it through our long diatribes on politics and so on and so forth. If you've made it to the end, thank you very much for watching. But if you have anything going on in your area that you would like to share with me and Shannon, that would be awesome. I would love to hear about it. We cannot know everything everywhere. And the goal of this podcast really is to share Canadian-centered stories around gender, whether it is in your school board, at your school, whether it's in I don't know, at work. It doesn't really matter where, whether it is in the Yukon or some small town in Quebec. We'd love to hear about what's going on in your area. If you want to share those stories with us, we could potentially highlight some of the goings on the show. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share as we close off our episode today.
I have a couple of last plugs as well, Melanie. In the Whisper networks this week, I learned of a protest in Montreal on the 16th of January. That is being led by one of the people who canceled Robert Wintemute last January on the university campus, trans activist. And they are protesting against the panel that is convening with a 2-year mandate to analyze, the impact of gender ideology. They're going to try and reverse engineer what the Dentons document has done in Quebec in all aspects. So if you want some details on that, there's some chatter about what might be happening, but I can connect you to some people in Montreal if you happen to be there or would like to be there. Of course, there's the Orillia protest, the invitation to the swim meet on the 18th, 19th, 20th, I think, of this month. And there's some details about that we put up earlier in the discussion. What else? I think that's kind of it for this week. Thanks very much for watching. It's been Pink Shirt Day on the Canadian Gender Wars Report. Have a great week.
Have a great week.
I wanted to make a little special addendum here this afternoon to the weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. On the 27th of January, I'm going to be hosting a national parents' rights coalition, call it a panel or a digital panel. On the Saturday, we're inviting people from coast to coast. We're going to have some guest speakers. We're going to have an analysis of a couple of important documents and policy frameworks that are coming out, some strategies and best practices from parents groups across the country. And there's going to be more details about that coming soon. So keep your eyes open for promotions of that. We'll talk about a bit more on next week's weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. Make sure you like and subscribe. And also, again, if you're watching, on the 7th of January, you still have time to sign the UN petition that we're talking about in this week's episode. Have a great week.
Thank you so much for watching. It's been an eye-opening year for sure. Click on one of these suggestions for some other stories in the gender landscape in Canada. Hope you like them.